Hi, welcome to Concepts of Web Performance. Today we're going to be talking about the load metric, or the page load metric. It's the oldest measure of web performance. I'm Todd Gardner from Request Metrics. Let's get started. So the load event, or the page load event. You've definitely used this before. It's the most common thing that we would attach to with JavaScript to make sure that something runs after a page has been loaded, like analytics or setting up a widget or attaching a calendar or kicking off our React app or whatever. But it's also the first way that we would measure web performance, measuring whether or not, measuring how long it took a page to be done. So what does it mean? Well, the page load event means that the HTML and all known resources have been fully downloaded and rendered. So any page or any image on the page, any JavaScript on the page, anything that JavaScript then put on the page before the load event fired, anything that we know about has been fully downloaded and done, except for any things that we explicitly decorated to be lazy loaded. Those could continue to run after the load event. The load event is part of the loading sequence of metrics that I've talked about, including time to first byte, document content, and loaded. And load is, by definition, always going to be the third and final one of these three. Where does this fall into a waterfall? Well, it's last. Usually waterfalls end in the load event. So we start here at the beginning when the user makes the initial request. We wait for the request to come back when the TTFB fires. We've received data back from the server. Once we've parsed that document, we know about all the resources that are in it. Document content will have fired, or document content loaded will have fired, even though we might not have finished all the images and frames and other things in the page. But when we do finish those, that's when the load event fires, when all of the things that we know about have been fully downloaded and rendered to the user. Visually, for most web pages, that means that they're done, that they have shown everything that they need to show you, and the page is ready. The little spinner is done loading somewhere in the browser. However, if you're using a lot of client-side rendering, it could just not be done yet. You could have a web architecture where you just start doing your work at the load event. And so it's not directly related to user experience, but in a lot of cases, the page will be nearly done at this point. So what does it mean? It means that the document is ready and update and reporting task, anything you want to do with JavaScript that's like not user interactive can begin. I highlight ready here because if you're an old school JavaScript developer, this is where like the jQuery ready thing would have attached to it, would have attached to this load event. How do you listen to it? Well, it's a plain old JavaScript event. So you just attach an add event listener at the global level and you listen for load. And then you can pull off the timestamp and do whatever you want to it. You could also add other functionality here to like kick off other JavaScript work in response to the page being fully loaded. But so the question here is, should you use the load event for web performance? It's definitely useful for all kinds of reasons around managing the life cycle of the page and when to do stuff. But does when the load event happen, does that matter for web performance? And I can give you a solid maybe. Maybe it does. It's a subjective measure of a technical milestone that we've reached. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the page is done, depending on the architecture that you use to build your website. What you can use it for is it's definitely a measure of that the page is initially complete. So you can measure the timing of an initially complete document. How long does it take that initial flurry of data, the initial HTML that you give down to the browser, how long does it take for that to get done for real users? And you can use it to compare the performance across browsers that might not support other metrics. This is what I feel like the most useful thing. So Safari, for example, doesn't support all of the core web vital metrics, but you can measure load there. You can measure load everywhere. And so if load is, 1.2 seconds in Chrome and load is 3 seconds in Safari, you know that even though you don't have those other metrics, that something is slower in Safari for your website, and you can use that as a comparator to explore and see what might be running slower. The things you can't do with the load event is that you can't compare different websites. You can't say, hey, example.com and amazon.com and target.com. You can't say one is faster than the other by looking at their load metric. because it just doesn't represent anything to the user. It doesn't represent any true state of completion because a lot of websites will do a bunch of work after the load event. And so you can't assume any user experience based on this metric, at least not blindly. Now, depending on how you built your website, if everything is set to be done before load, maybe you can assume that. Maybe you can. But completely going into a website blind, not knowing anything about it, I can't assume that the page is done just because the load event is fired. If you want to learn more about the load event and other web performance metrics, check out my training on Front-End Masters, the Fundamentals of Web Performance. We cover load as well as a bunch of other metrics, how to make your website faster, how to plan for performance, how to monitor performance, all kinds of other interesting things. Or if you're looking to make your load event and your overall website faster, check out Request Metrics, the unified web performance monitoring tool. It combines real user monitoring, lab testing, and Google's data together to give you a comprehensive view of what's slowing down your website and how to make it faster. This was the load event on Concepts of Web Performance. Thanks so much for joining me. If I taught you something, how about you give me a like, and we'll see you next time.